For 50 years, the Port of Moses Lake has been an integral part of the area and the city of Moses Lake. It has helped spur economic growth in Grant County, brought some of the world's most interesting aircraft to the skies above the city, and turned a possible economic disaster for the community into a thriving, bustling facility that regularly adds jobs to the local economy. If it weren't for a bit of luck and a lot of hard work, the Port of Moses Lake might never have come to fruition. It's a story of wars both hot and cold. It's a story of the people of the area coming together to fight for their city and community. It's a story of how one man, Clyde Owen, who never thought he'd be part of the Moses Lake community, helped bring prosperity to the city. It is a story of people joining together for a purpose, and men with the vision to see what the future could be. It wasn't always good times, and when the worst time hit, it all started with the search for an envelope.
Well, the morning of it was the 24th of November, I believe, 1964. I was sitting in the office and I got a phone call from the general who was in charge of our division that was out of Fairchild. And he said, "Clyde, did you get that envelope yet?" And I said, "No, I haven't got any envelope." And he said, "Damn it, I sent you an envelope and you should have it by now." I said, "Sir, I'm sorry, I don't have any letter from you." He called about every 15 minutes. "Did you get my envelope?" I said, "No, I haven't got it yet." So that kept going on. And finally, the vice commander down the street away from me called. He said, "What in the world is going on? The general keeps saying he's trying to send you an envelope and you claim you don't have it." And so we were sitting down there and the General Kingsbury, called again, and at that time I was in the office with Colonel Templeman. Well, Kingsbury said, "We got to get this thing announced. What I want to tell you, tell the secretary to come in and I'll dictate the letter to her and then you'll find out." So we called the lady in and she told me, she said, "By the way, there's a man out in the office waiting for you that wanted to see you. He has an envelope for you, but I tell him that you're too busy to get the envelope." So
let's go back to the beginning. For centuries, the lake in the middle of the Columbia Basin was a place where Native Americans gathered camas roots and waterfowl eggs on its shores. Settlement by whites came later than surrounding areas and was slow because the land of sagebrush and bunchgrass was too dry for farming. By 1910, settlers had formed a small community named Nippel. Moses Lake was incorporated in 1938 as a sleepy, dusty farming town on the shores of a large, shallow natural lake. Its population was 302 residents. The lake and the town were named after Chief Moses, head of the local Sinkius tribe. Growth was slow and disasters such as drought and fire beset the community. Moses Lake stayed small and sleepy until world events interceded. The year was 1942. Conflict was enveloping the planet as World War II raged in Europe and the Pacific. The U.S. Army Air Forces needed pilots for fighters and bombers to attack the enemy in their industrial centers in Germany and later Japan. To help train those pilots, Moses Lake Airfield was opened on November 24th to train P-38 Lightning twin-engine fighter pilots and B-17 Flying Fortress bomber pilots. The Army Air Forces were attracted to the area by its sunny days, clear airspace, and wide open spaces. Even when it wasn't sunny, the flight ceiling was usually high. Beginning in early 1943, the United States Army Air Forces and the British Royal Air Force began a campaign of attacking Germany with strategic bombing. Losses were horrific among the B-17 crews. In the beginning, neither the US nor the British had fighters that could escort the bombers all the way to Germany and back. The unescorted bombers were no match for Luftwaffe fighters piloted by experienced German pilots. Moses Lake Airfield helped train the replacement pilots needed for the war effort. On May 19, 1944, the Columbia Basin Herald reported that decorated veteran pilots from the war in the Pacific were in Moses Lake to train new pilots in the intricacies of combat flying. In May 1945, shortly before the end of the war, Moses Lake Airfield was mothballed. Undoubtedly, this had an economic impact on the area, but it was short-lived. By 1950, the population of Moses Lake had grown to almost 1,700. When the Columbia Basin Project brought water to the farms surrounding Moses Lake in the mid-1950s, the town began another of its boom and bust cycles. Moses Lake is situated between the strategic assets of Grand Coulee Dam and the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. Grand Coulee produced electricity that was used to make the aluminum that went into aircraft for the newly formed Air Force. Aluminum is found in nature as bauxite that must be transformed into pure metal. The energy needs of the process are extensive, and Grand Coulee Dam had the hydropower generators to meet those needs. Hanford was a key component in America's nuclear arsenal, producing the plutonium that went into nuclear weapons. Reactors along the Columbia River were used to turn uranium into weapons-grade plutonium. The end of World War II brought a new kind of conflict to America, the Cold War, with the Soviet Union and a nuclear arms race that lasted for decades until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989. To protect Grand Coulee Dam and Hanford from a possible bombing by the Soviet Union, in 1948, the Moses Lake Air Base was reopened and was initially home to the 325th All-Weather Fighter Wing. The 325th Fighter Group had distinguished itself during World War II during the Italian campaign, escorting bombers and strafing targets. It earned 2 Distinguished Unit Citation Awards for action against the enemy. At Moses Lake, the 325th flew F-82 twin Mustang fighters. This was a twin-engined propeller plane based on the famed P-51 Mustang fighters of World War II. The plane was essentially 2 Mustang fuselages tied together by a wing. In 1950, the 325th Fighter Wing received its first jets, the F-94 Starfire. That same year, the base was named Larson Air Force Base, for Major Donald A. Larson of Yakima, a highly decorated fighter pilot who died in combat over the skies of Europe in World War II. He had flown 57 combat missions when his P-51 Thunderbolt with the nose name Mary Queen of Scots was shot down and crashed near Uelzen, Germany. Larson Air Force Base continued to grow as in the early 1950s it acquired a troop carrier wing and an air transportation operation. Meanwhile, Moses Lake had turned into a boomtown. For the city, the good news was that the new base brought in 1,000 military and civilian personnel and their paychecks. By 1952, population of Moses Lake was estimated at 4,244, up 60% in 2 years. The town grew so rapidly that the business district became scattered over several streets and chopped into several wide-apart districts, according to a 1951 story in the Spokane Spokesman Review. In 1952, tragedy struck Larson Air Force Base on December 20th, as troops from the Korean War were being transported home in Operation Sleigh Ride, when a C-124 cargo plane with 115 souls on board crashed on takeoff. There were 87 killed in what was, at the time, the deadliest air crash in the world. Meanwhile, the schools in Moses Lake were struggling to keep up with the growth of the city. In 1954, enrollment in the Moses Lake School District had jumped 3-fold in 5 years and 20-fold in 10 years. The crunch was so acute that in 1954, Larson barracks were put to use as classrooms. Located close to Boeing plants in the Seattle area, Larson Air Force Base was ideal for a test flight center.
That whole area was called Plant 52 when it was built by the Air Force strictly for the Boeing company. And that would included the 3 hangars and all the acreage around the thing.
Larson was also close to the plant where B-52s were built, and they were delivered to the Air Force in Moses Lake.
They had delivered more than half of the B-52s to the Air Force here. The facility itself was built in the mid-50s. Right. 3 buildings, 3 big hangars. It was in total a separate facility from Larson Air Force Base. The head man was a Boeing employee, and they delivered all up through the D model. The B-52 was delivered to the Air Force here.
B-52 Stratofortresses and KC-135 Stratotanker refueling planes were soon plying the skies over Moses Lake. In 1960, Larson Air Force Base became a strategic air command base. Eventually, it would have 15 B-52 bombers, each capable of carrying 4 nuclear weapons. The B-52 is a long-range subsonic strategic bomber with the mission to retaliate against the Soviet Union in the case of a nuclear war. The B-52 is still in service with the Air Force, the plane's older than the pilots who fly them. It is expected, with upgrades, to remain in service until 2040, almost 90 years after it was introduced. The KC-135 is a modified Boeing 707 and was the Air Force's first jet-powered refueling tanker. It too is still in service, but is being replaced by the KC-46, a modified Boeing 767. Larson Air Force Base was part of the supply chain that brought KC-135 aircraft into the military.
They moved all of the B-52 assembly and production from the Boeing plant to Wichita, Kansas. And after that, the F, G, and H models of the B-52 were made and delivered in Wichita, Kansas. They did that because at that time, then, the Air Force had entered into a contract with the Boeing company to build the brand new tanker, the KC-135 tanker. It was built in Seattle, brought over here, and all 650 of them were delivered to the Air Force here in Moses Lake, all but the last 2 or 3.
Of the 15 B-52s at the base, 6 were on combat readiness at all times, along with 4 KC-135 tankers to refuel them on their journey to bomb Russia. The base also had 3 Titan missile silos scattered across the area that it was responsible for maintaining and overseeing. The Missile Air Support branch of the 462nd Strategic Aerospace Wing was stationed at Larson to support the Titan bases by flying crews and equipment via helicopter to what were then the remote locations of the silos. They also engaged in search and rescue, often of lost hunters, in eastern Washington, northern Idaho, western Montana, and northern Oregon. This was how Colonel Clyde Owen found Larson Air Force Base when he took command in 1962. The Air Force built a huge hangar that could hold 8 of the massive B-52s at once.
Well, then when the Boeing moved out of the facility, then the Air Force moved a whole lot of their facilities over there. The airplanes had all been parked, as I rate through, in the western part of the Air Force. Then the Air Force took over all of the area that Boeing had vacated. And in one building, the one big building that we talk about, I always refer to as the 8-place hangar, it would hold 8 B-52 airplanes completely undercover with the tail sticking out. And in one of the bays, they had established the missile maintenance facility. That's where they maintained the Titan I missile. We had a spare missile, and they would bring them in and they would rotate the missiles. We moved all of the civil engineering functions over into one of the big bays, the carpentry shop, all the items that would go with civil engineer. In one of the bays, we moved, and every supply item that was on the base was all in this one big place. Then we kept one bay, the 4th bay nearest on the ramp, available for aircraft maintenance if was needed. Now, the only other facility that was in there at the time was the paint hangar, which is a great big facility that would be able to paint 2 B-52s, the airplane, fully inside a hangar. Incidentally, there was never an airplane ever painted in that big hangar.
Owen was originally from Kansas, where he started in the National Guard in 1940. He joined the Army Air Forces, which later became the Air Force, where he served for 26 years. He flew 24 different aircraft during his career, including the B-52 that he commanded at Larson. During World War II, he was flying a B-26 bomber that was shot down over Germany. Owen ordered his crew to jump while he continued to fly the crippled aircraft. He was the last one out, and he barely escaped capture. While the Larson base appeared to be a vital cog in the strategic plans of the Air Force, there were signs it was low priority. Budgets were just barely enough to keep the base operational. The facilities dated from 1942 and were never updated. Even Owen's headquarters was heated by an old oil stove. Air Force personnel had a nickname for the rundown base, Moses Hole. Owen said it was no doubt the worst equipped, worst prepared base I'd ever seen. The Air Force for some reason painted all the facilities pink. I don't know where in the world they got a bunch of pink paint, but they did, Owen said. In 1961, President Kennedy appointed Robert McNamara as Secretary of Defense. McNamara had helped rebuild the Ford Motor Company after World War II and served briefly as the company's president. He brought to the Department of Defense a business-like mentality. He said that even though the United States could afford to spend a lot on defense, this ability does not excuse us from applying strict standards of effectiveness and efficiency to the way we spend our defense dollars. McNamara instituted a much-publicized cost reduction program which, he reported, saved $14 billion in the 5-year period beginning in 1961. That's $112 billion in today's money. On November 10, 1964, a list of 95 military establishments to be shut down was released by the Pentagon. Larson was on that list. Larson was one of 4 strategic air command bases on the list. Ironically, one reason given for the closure of Larson was the fact that most of the facilities dated back to World War II, facilities the Air Force never provided the money to update. While McNamara faced much criticism from Congress for closing military bases he didn't think were needed, he continued to announce closures. Even Washington's 2 powerful senators at the time, Warren Magnuson and Henry Scoop Jackson, couldn't save the base from McNamara's axe. The announcement that Larson would be closed came November 24, 1964. It was up to Clyde Owen to inform the community of the bad news.
Finally, I got a hold of the envelope, and it was just a letter addressed to me that I had to go make the announcement. First thing I had to do was call all the civilian employees together. We had about 450, to tell them that their job was secure. They would be able to be transferred to other places. They had bumping rights and things like that. Then I had to go and start telling mainly the newspaper and the people of the town. So first of all, by that time it was about 11 o'clock. And so we got a hold of the personnel officer and the civilian personnel officer to gather all of the employees, the civilian employees that we could get together to meet in the theater right away, and we had a time. So we had most of them there, and all I had to go on was, back in those days, you didn't have a copy machine, so all I had to go was the letter. So I had to read them the letter, and then I don't remember, Ned Thomas was the editor of the newspaper. He's kind of a gruff old boy, and I called Ned. I said, I got something pretty important for you. And I said, you might want to hold up the paper, because I knew they put the thing to bed about 1 o'clock. Now, I said, I don't think we got time to wait. And I said, well, Ned, it's pretty important. They said, well, he said, if you can get down here, we'll hold it up for you. So I grabbed my personnel, or my public information officer, a boy by the name of Goldberg, a lieutenant. And so we went charging down, and I showed Ned the letter. And then I had to get back out to the base. By that time, I had to tell the rest of the people. And Goldberg went around to tell the radio stations and things like that of the news. So that was the start of getting the word that the base was going to close.
On November 23rd, an Associated Press report said that McNamara's decision was, quote, absolutely, unequivocally, without qualification, irrevocable. The Moses Lake community was in shock. The Grant County Journal printed an editorial saying, now is the time for concerned action. If ever the Tri-Cities of Moses Lake, Ephrata, and Soap Lake needed to join hands to look upward toward future potentials of Larson Air Force Base, the time is now. The editorial continued, there is much at stake for all of us. Let us hang our crying towels on the rack and wipe the tears from our eyes. We're flat on our back and we're looking up. Let us not divert attention from this high objective. The community did not stay flat on their backs. A group was formed called the Larson Action Committee, headed by the president of Big Bend Community College, Dr. Al Phillips.
I guess then the next thing that happened was the citizens got together, and the head man of all of this was a Dr. Al Phillips, who at that time was the president of Community College, working from the South Campus, of course. And they got together and they put a committee together called the Larson Action Committee. And it involved people from Soap Lake and from Ephrata. I remember some of the names. Harold Stadshog was the mayor. Alex Law was one of the key officials. Mode Sneed was a county commissioner, and he was on it. Howard Copenhagen, I think, was the president of the Chamber of Commerce, and there was one or two. Jim Abrams was on it.
First, the community went to Washington, D.C. to try to talk the Department of Defense out of closing the base. When that didn't work, they looked at turning the closed base into a community asset. Port districts were common in Grant County, and there were already 8 of them, covering most of the county except for Ephrata, Soap Lake, and Moses Lake. The port, which has taxing authority, was created to buy or otherwise acquire base facilities from the government and to manage them. "You have to know what you want and know who to deal with," Owen said in 1988. Larson Air Force Base wasn't closed immediately. There was a 1.5-year grace period, and the base was scheduled to be closed June 30th, 1966. While the committee was formed and even after the port district was authorized, all that time, it was still an operational base.
And during all of this time, the base was still fully operational. We still were doing combat training missions. We still had 6 B-52s on alert, round the clock, armed with nuclear weapons, and 4 tankers on alert. So during 1965, it was pretty much business as usual as far as the air base was concerned. In fact, we kept flying training missions up until February of 1966.
One problem Owen had to deal with was the Job Corps facility which was put on the base.
May of 1965, I got a call in my office from the Bureau of Reclamation, Ephrata, that they had been directed to come over to Moses Lake and review Larson Air Force Base for the purpose of establishing a 200-man Job Corps training facility on the base. So a man by the name of Downs came over with a group, and they selected, and together we selected the area where they are now, is where we would put the Job Corps. Never by my sheer imagination would they ever drop that Job Corps right in the middle of an active air base. But that's what they did. The Job Corps came in December of 65, and in that area, we had 3 maintenance squadrons living, and I was given 2 weeks to vacate that area and move the maintenance people into someplace else to make that space available for the Job Corps. It was a group of African American kids coming out of the areas of Detroit and Chicago that had never been on an airplane before and had never been out of Chicago or Detroit. They had not very much for them to do, and you had to remember, we had the Job Corps, all 200 of them, within the inside of the base, within the security area. Our main security, of course, is the main gate stopping, and then all the security inside of the base was roving patrols or an individual guard per airplane. So these kids kind of had a free run of the air base. They were thrilled to see a B-52 airplane, and we had trouble. They got right. They could, from where they were located, they could get out right under the airplane as the airplane was landing. They were so enthused about seeing an airplane. And then they got excited. They could go up and down the runway, and we had globes on the lighting system, which was only snapped on there, and that became a great collector's item for them. They stole all the globes off and it's hard to explain because there they were running loose within the base with only roving patrols of security. And of course, we had places where beer was sold, which of course we couldn't let them use, but they had troubles because they wanted to go to those places. That was the trouble we had with the Job Corps finally.
Owen had no reason to suspect he would become such an integral part of the future of Moses Lake and the port.
I have to explain at that time, I actually had no concern of what was going to happen. I knew that I would be transferred the minute things had closed, nor did I ever know that I would ever get involved later with the port.
From a sleepy, dusty town on the banks of a shallow, waterfowl-rich lake, Moses Lake was on the verge of something new and exciting. The foresight and dedication of residents of the time helped push through the Port of Moses Lake, a move that spelled a bright economic future for the community. The vision of community leaders who didn't let the wonderful asset of the former Larson Air Force Base go to waste, and the formation of the Port of Moses Lake, helped make Moses Lake in Grant County what it is today. Today, the Air Force is gone except for the occasional visit or flyover by aircraft. The 325th Fighter Wing is stationed at Tyndall Air Force Base near Panama City, Florida. It is one of the first fighter wings to fly the F-22 Raptor fighters. B-52 squadrons are in Louisiana and North Dakota. The KC-135 is being phased out of service, but is still stationed in places such as Fort Worth, Texas, Wichita, Kansas, and Fairchild Air Force Base outside of Spokane. In place of the Air Force, the Port of Moses Lake has helped the community in ways that cannot be enumerated.